Lily sat quietly in the driver's seat of her car, staring at the old house in front of her. The sun was beginning to set behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows over the yard. Her grandmother's house had always seemed ancient, but now, standing there on the overgrown lawn, it felt more like a forgotten relic of another time, a place where the past clung to the walls and whispered its secrets in the wind. She had only recently inherited the house after her grandmother's sudden passing. The death had been a shock, one that Lily wasn't quite ready to face. But now, there was no choice but to return and sort through her grandmother's belongings, a task that had been delayed for far too long. Taking a deep breath, Lily opened the car door and stepped out onto the gravel driveway. The chill of the autumn air bit at her skin as she grabbed her suitcase from the trunk and walked up the creaky front steps. The door, once white, was now a faded shade of yellow, and the brass knocker had tarnished with age. It was the kind of house that could have belonged in a ghost story, its windows staring blankly out at the world like eyes that had long since lost their ability to see. As she stepped inside, a thick smell of dust and aged wood greeted her, filling her lungs with a strange sense of nostalgia. It was a smell she hadn't experienced in years, not since her childhood visits to this very house. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with antique furniture that seemed to have been abandoned in place, each item shrouded in layers of dust. Lily walked into the living room, taking in the familiar old furniture, the velvet sofa with the floral patterns her grandmother had adored, the crooked bookshelf that seemed on the verge of collapsing under the weight of forgotten novels. Everything was still in its place, as though her grandmother had only stepped away for a moment. But there was one place in the house Lily had always been forbidden to enter: the attic. Her grandmother had always told her to stay away from the attic. "There are things up there that don't belong to this world," her grandmother had said with a certain solemnity in her voice, as if the warning was something more than just superstition. Lily had never pressed for details, but now, as an adult, the mystery of the attic called to her. What had her grandmother kept hidden up there? Why had she been so adamant about Lily's never stepping foot in the room? After unpacking her things and gathering her courage, Lily decided it was time. She had no intention of leaving the house until she had discovered the truth behind her grandmother's strange behavior. She made her way to the creaky staircase and began to ascend. The stairs groaned under her weight, as though they were protesting her intrusion. When she reached the top, she stood before the old attic door. The faded wood was covered in scratches and marks, evidence of years of neglect. Her heart raced, her hand trembling as she reached for the brass doorknob. With a deep breath, Lily turned the knob and pushed open the door. The attic was dark, save for the thin stream of light that trickled through a dusty window. The air was thick and musty, and the smell of old paper and mothballs clung to her clothes. She could barely make out the outlines of various old furniture, boxes, and clutter, but it was the center of the room that caught her attention. In the middle of the attic sat a rocking chair, its wooden frame worn and chipped from years of use. And sitting on the chair was an old doll. Lily froze. The doll was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its porcelain face was delicately painted, with rosy cheeks and glassy eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. Its long, dark hair was carefully styled, and its little white dress was tattered at the edges, as if it had been passed down through generations. Despite its delicate features, the doll radiated an unnerving sense of life, as though it were watching her. Her heart thudded in her chest, and for a moment, Lily hesitated. The doll's unblinking gaze seemed to pierce through her, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew she should turn around and leave, but something about the doll compelled her to step closer. As she approached the chair, she noticed a faint sound. It was almost imperceptible at first, but as she drew nearer, it became clearer, a soft, eerie lullaby. The melody seemed to emanate from nowhere, drifting through the air like an old, forgotten tune. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the song wrapped itself around her, pulling her deeper into the attic. She reached out, her fingers brushing the doll's cold, smooth face. The moment her skin touched it, the lullaby stopped, and the room fell into an unsettling silence. Lily pulled her hand back, heart racing. She took one last glance at the doll before quickly exiting the attic, shutting the door behind her with a trembling hand. The house was silent again, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had been awakened. The house was unnervingly quiet. The only sounds Lily heard were the occasional creaks of the floorboards beneath her feet as she moved about the house. She had spent the morning unpacking her things and exploring the familiar but faded rooms of her grandmother's home, but the unease that had settled in her chest since her encounter with the doll had only grown. Lily couldn't explain it. Her grandmother's house had always been a place of comfort for her as a child. Now, it felt like a place that was harboring dark secrets. The doll she had found in the attic still lingered in her mind, its glassy eyes seeming to follow her wherever she went, its lullaby echoing through her thoughts. Despite the strange pull it had on her, she hadn't dared to return to the attic. She knew she should leave it alone, but the curiosity gnawed at her. That evening, after a long, tiring day, Lily decided to go to bed early. She hoped that a good night's sleep would calm her nerves. She made sure to lock the door to her room and pulled the covers tightly around her. The night outside was still and cold, the wind barely rustling the branches of the old trees that surrounded the house. The first few hours passed in silence. Lily found herself drifting into a restless sleep, but the quiet was soon broken by an unexpected sound. It was faint at first, a whisper, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. She jolted awake, straining to listen. The whisper came again, closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, a child's voice, murmuring in the darkness. It wasn't the voice of an adult, but the high-pitched, almost melodic whisper of someone small, someone innocent. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, her heart racing as she glanced around her dark room. There was no one there. The air felt thick with tension, as though something was lurking in the shadows. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped, and a silence that felt suffocating descended over the room. Lily lay back down, trying to convince herself that it was just a figment of her imagination, the result of a long day and an unsettled mind. But as the seconds ticked by, something else caught her attention. The soft, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair. It wasn't just the wind. Lily's pulse quickened as she realized that the sound was coming from the attic. The same eerie, rhythmic rocking she had heard earlier when she first laid eyes on the doll. Without thinking, she threw off the covers and grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table. The beam of light flickered nervously as she made her way down the hall toward the attic door. Her heart pounded in her chest as the sound of the rocking grew louder, as though the chair was moving faster, almost with a sense of urgency. Lily's hand hovered over the doorknob. She knew she shouldn't open the door. She knew she should turn around and go back to her room, but the temptation was too great. The curiosity that had led her to the attic earlier was back in full force, and this time, she couldn't ignore it. With a trembling hand, she twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the dim beam of her flashlight. The rocking chair was there, in the center of the room, its wooden frame creaking with each motion. But the doll wasn't sitting in it. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She was certain the doll had been in the chair earlier that day. She had seen it, its glassy eyes staring at her from the shadows. But now it was gone. The chair rocked by itself, the soft squeaking of the wood the only sound in the room. Suddenly, Lily felt a cold chill run down her spine. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, a feeling that made her want to run, to escape. But something held her there, rooted to the spot. She could feel the weight of the air around her, as though the house itself was watching her, waiting for her next move. The flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. For a moment, Lily thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, something small and dark, darting between the boxes and old furniture. But when she turned the light in that direction, there was nothing there. The chair creaked again, this time louder, as though it was being rocked with purpose. Lily stepped forward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She slowly approached the chair, her heart thumping in her chest. And then, without warning, the doll appeared. It wasn't in the chair, but it was standing at the edge of the room, staring at her. Its porcelain face was now cracked in several places, the dark lines running across its face like a web of ancient scars. Its eyes, once lifelike, were now darker, more hollow. They seemed to follow her every move, never blinking, never turning away. Lily gasped, her feet frozen to the floor. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to run from the attic, from the doll, from whatever force was pulling her into this nightmare. But before she could turn to flee, the doll's head tilted to the side, as if it were observing her with interest. Then, with a sudden jerking motion, the doll started to move. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the doll began to walk toward her. Each step it took was unnatural, its limbs stiff, jerking as though they were controlled by something outside of itself. The sound of its movements echoed through the attic, a soft shuffling, like the scrape of porcelain against wood. It moved slowly at first, but as it grew closer, it quickened, its pace becoming more frantic, more desperate. Lily couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her feet glued to the floor as the doll advanced toward her. The doll stopped just inches away, its glassy eyes never leaving hers. Lily could hear the faintest whisper again, the same child's voice from before. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, almost as if the doll was speaking directly into her mind. "Help me." The words sent a shiver down Lily's spine. She tried to step back, but her legs betrayed her. She was paralyzed, unable to move as the doll's cold, porcelain hand reached out toward her. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the doll stopped. It froze in place, staring at her with that eerie, lifeless gaze. Lily snapped out of her stupor and backed away, her breath ragged and shallow. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't stay in that attic another second. She turned and fled from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She stood in the dark hallway, her back pressed against the wall, her body trembling with fear. Her mind raced, but there was one thought that stood out above all the others. The doll wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it wanted something from her. The following day, Lily couldn't shake the image of the doll's face from her mind. Its glassy eyes, its stiff movements, the way it had silently approached her as though it had a will of its own. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again, standing in front of her, its head tilted to the side, its cracked porcelain skin gleaming in the dim light of the attic. It was as if the doll had planted itself deep into her mind, refusing to let go. Lily tried to go about her day, forcing herself to make coffee, unpack the last few boxes, and tidy up the house. But nothing seemed right. The house, once filled with memories of her childhood, now felt alien and unsettling, like a place where the past had never fully let go. The walls seemed to whisper, the floorboards creaked too loudly, and the silence between the rooms was pregnant with something unspeakable. She had to know more about the doll. She had to understand what it was, why it was here, and why it was haunting her. That afternoon, she decided to visit Mr. Blackwell, the local historian, the one person in town who might have some answers. Mr. Blackwell was an elderly man, well into his 80s, with a sharp mind that seemed to defy his age. He had lived in the town his entire life and knew its history as well as anyone. Lily had known him as a child, and although their paths hadn't crossed much in recent years, she hoped he could shed some light on the mystery of the doll. The moment Lily stepped into the small, cluttered office of the Historical Society, she was greeted with the familiar scent of old books and paper. Mr. Blackwell sat behind a cluttered desk, his thick glasses perched precariously on his nose as he pored over a dusty ledger. His sharp eyes looked up when he heard the door creak open. "Lily," he said with a slow smile, his voice gravelly but warm. "It's been a long time. How are you, my dears?" "I'm doing well," she replied, though her voice faltered a bit. "But I need your help with something. I found something in my grandmother's house, and I need to know more about it." Mr. Blackwell raised an eyebrow, setting aside the ledger. "What have you found?" Lily hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain it, the doll, the feeling of being watched, the whispers in the night. But she had to start somewhere. "There's a doll in the attic," she said quietly. "I don't know why, but it's strange. I think it might be haunted. At the mention of the doll, Mr. Blackwell's expression changed. His eyes, which had once seemed so friendly, hardened for a moment, and he looked down at his hands, clasped in front of him. Haunted, he repeated, his voice lower now. Where exactly did you find this dolls? Lily told him about the attic, about how she had come across the doll sitting in the rocking chair, how it had moved on its own, and how its eyes seemed to follow her around the room. She told him about the whispers and the eerie lullaby, the feeling that something was waiting for her to do something, anything, that would unleash its full force. Mr. Blackwell was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as though he was lost in thought. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice somber. You've stumbled upon something much darker than you realize, he said quietly. That doll, it's not just haunted. It's part of something much more sinister. Lily's heart skipped a beat. She leaned forward, eager for answers. Tell me more, she urged.
What do you know about it?
Mr. Blackwell sighed and ran a hand through his thinning white hair. It's not the first time something like this has happened in this town. That doll, it's connected to a tragedy that goes back more than 100 years. It was owned by a young girl named Mary, who lived in the house you now own. Lily's stomach dropped. Mary? What happened to hers? Mr. Blackwell paused, choosing his words carefully. Mary was a beautiful child, full of life. Her family was well off, known for their wealth and social standing. But there were rumors surrounding them, rumors about strange practices, dark dealings with forces beyond this world. Lily frowned. What kind of forces? Occult forces, Mr. Blackwell replied, his voice low. Mary's parents were not as they appeared. They had become involved with the occult, with practices that were forbidden. They sought to gain power, wealth, and eternal life. But in doing so, they made a pact with something far older and more malevolent than they could ever have imagined. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors about occult practices in the area when she was younger, but she had always dismissed them as old wives' tales, stories to frighten children. But now, the weight of Mr. Blackwell's words pressed on her chest, as though the very air around her had thickened with the revelation. Mary's parents were obsessed with the idea of immortality, Mr. Blackwell continued, his eyes darkening. They believed that by binding their souls to an ancient entity, they could cheat death. But it came at a terrible price. The entity they sought to bind themselves to demanded something in return. Lily's throat tightened. What did it want? Sacrifice, Mr. Blackwell said, his voice barely a whisper.
Mary.
The child was to be the offering, the vessel through which the entity would enter this world. But Mary, innocent and unaware, became part of something she couldn't understand. And when she died, her death was no accident. It was the result of a ritual gone horribly wrong. Lily felt a wave of nausea sweep over her. How did she die? Mr. Blackwell's eyes grew haunted as he looked down at his hands. No one knows for sure. Some say she died from a sickness. Others say it was an accident. But the truth is far more sinister. Mary's parents performed a dark ritual that took her life, but in doing so, they trapped her spirit in the doll. Her soul became bound to the porcelain. Her cries and whispers were echoes of a tortured existence. Lily's mind raced as she tried to process everything. So the doll, it's the vessel for her spirit? Mr. Blackwell nodded slowly.
Yes.
And over the years, it has taken on a life of its own, feeding on the energy of those who come into contact with it. Your grandmother must have known about its dark nature, which is why she kept it hidden away. But once you touched it, once you brought it back into the light, it awakened. Lily's breath was shallow as she struggled to understand. But why me? Why is it haunting me? Mr. Blackwell's face was grim. The doll is drawn to those who are vulnerable, those who are curious, those who are searching for something, answers, solace, power. It senses your fear, your uncertainty, and once it has you in its grip, it won't let go. Lily felt as though the ground beneath her was slipping away. What can I do to stop it? Mr. Blackwell stood up, walking to the bookshelf behind him. He pulled out an old, leather-bound book and opened it to a page marked with a worn ribbon. He handed it to Lily, his eyes grave. This is a record of the rituals that were once performed in this town, the rites that Mary's parents used to bind her to the doll. You must destroy the doll, Lily. Burn it. Bury the ashes in holy ground. That is the only way to break the curse. Lily took the book, her hands trembling. She could feel the weight of its pages, the dark history embedded in every word. The truth was undeniable now, but the idea of confronting the doll again, the thing that had already shown her its terrifying power, was almost too much to bear. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll do it." Mr. Blackwell nodded. "Be careful, Lily. The doll is not easily destroyed. And if you fail, it will come for you." With that final warning hanging in the air, Lily left Mr. Blackwell's office, her mind reeling from the horrifying history she had just learned. The doll wasn't just a haunted relic. It was a prison for a tortured soul, and its power was more than she could ever have imagined. And now it wanted her. Lily's return to the house was marked by an overwhelming sense of dread. The weight of the knowledge she had just acquired about the doll, about Mary, and the dark pact made by her family hung over her like a dark cloud. The idea that something ancient and malevolent had been lurking in the shadows of her grandmother's house, waiting for her to uncover it, was too much to comprehend. The moment she stepped through the front door, she felt it, the presence. The house seemed colder, emptier. The rooms, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien, like places where the air itself was heavy with sorrow and despair. She shivered as a gust of wind rattled the windows, though the night was calm outside. It was as if the house, too, was breathing in and out, pulsing with a dark energy. Lily had thought she might return to the attic, gather the doll, and burn it as Mr. Blackwell suggested. But now, standing in the hallway of her grandmother's home, she found herself paralyzed with fear. What if the doll was aware of her plan? What if it was waiting for her? The last time she had gone to the attic, it had felt like the doll was watching her, moving on its own accord. And that was before she had even touched it. Her thoughts spiraled, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had to face it. She had no choice. But the mere idea of facing that lifeless porcelain face again was enough to send waves of nausea through her body. Lily forced herself to take a step forward, then another, and another, moving down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the stairs that led to the attic. Each creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to echo too loudly, too ominously in the silence of the house. She had to do it. She had to stop the doll from tormenting her. But as she climbed the stairs, a thought gnawed at her. What if it wasn't just the doll? Lily stopped halfway up the stairs, her hand resting on the banister, the shadows creeping around her like a suffocating fog. She turned her head to look toward the hallway at the end of the stairs, where her grandmother's old bedroom used to be. The door to that room was shut, but there was something strange about it. The air felt thicker around that part of the house, as though something was waiting on the other side of that door. For a moment, Lily considered going in, searching her grandmother's things for answers. But she was afraid. She was afraid of what she might find there. After all, if her grandmother had known about the doll's curse, there was a chance that the room might hold even more dark secrets. She couldn't risk it, not when the doll was still out there. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faintest sound, a soft tapping, barely audible, like a child knocking on a door. The noise came from the attic. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was so quiet at first that she might have imagined it. But then it came again.
Tap, tap, tap.
Her heart raced, and instinctively, she turned toward the attic door. It stood in front of her like a looming threat, its weathered wood grim and uninviting. Her mind screamed at her to turn away, to leave the house, to find someone who could help her. But the pull of the attic was too strong. The doll was up there, and it was waiting. With shaking hands, Lily reached for the door handle and twisted it open. The air that poured out from the attic was cold, colder than it should have been, given the mildness of the evening outside. The attic was a dark void, a place where the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe. She flipped on the light, and for a moment, she thought she saw the doll sitting in the rocking chair again, just as she had left it. But when the light fully illuminated the room, it was empty. The rocking chair was still, its wood untouched. Her gaze shifted to the far corner of the attic. And there it was, the doll. It wasn't on the chair, nor on the shelf where she had left it. It was standing, upright, at the edge of the room, as though it had been placed there by invisible hands. Its cracked face stared at her with that same haunting intensity, its glass eyes gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. Lily's pulse spiked, her breath shallow and quick. Why was it standing? Why was it out of place? Her heart pounded as she moved toward it. She had to end this. She had to burn the doll and bury the ashes, just as Mr. Blackwell had told her. But the closer she got to it, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air thickened, heavy with something suffocating. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched. The whispering began again. It was faint at first, like the flutter of a distant voice, but then it grew louder, clearer. The words were indistinct, as though the doll itself was speaking directly into her mind. 1,000 voices merged into one haunting, pleading sound. Help me, help me. Lily's legs felt like jelly beneath her, her body trembling as she fought to move forward. She had to do it, she had to destroy it. But a deep fear rooted her in place, as if the doll was calling to her, drawing her in with some kind of unseen force. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. Please, help me. You're the only one who can. Help me. Lily's hand went to her throat, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her body screamed for her to leave, to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She couldn't pull herself away from the doll, from the cold, lifeless eyes that seemed to beckon her closer. The voice grew frantic. Don't leave me. You promised. Lily's heart stopped. The words, you promised, struck her like a thunderclap. She hadn't promised anything. Had she? The voice in her mind became clearer, and she realized with a shock that it was Mary, the little girl who had once lived in this house. Mary's soul was trapped in the doll, her voice, her spirit, begging for release. The truth that had seemed so distant before was now a cruel, raw reality. Lily's mind spun. What had she gotten herself into? Was it really possible that she could free Mary? Or was she only making things worse? Suddenly, the doll's eyes shifted. It wasn't just the porcelain face that terrified her now. It was the movement, the presence. The doll was alive, and its gaze locked onto Lily with the intensity of something far more dangerous than a simple haunted object. Then, without warning, the rocking chair began to creak.
Tap, tap, tap.
But this time, it wasn't the faint sound of a child knocking on a door. It was the unmistakable sound of the doll's porcelain feet moving. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the doll began to walk toward her. The sound of porcelain feet scraping against the wooden floor sent a jolt of terror through Lily's body. The doll had moved, it was no longer stationary, and now it was coming toward her. She stood frozen, the air thick with an oppressive weight as the doll's stiff, jerky movements brought it closer, step by unsteady step. Each tap of its small porcelain feet echoed through the attic like a death knell, the sound growing louder and louder, resonating deep within her chest. Lily's heart was pounding so loudly in her ears that she could hardly hear anything else, but she felt the presence. Something dark and hungry was looming in the room with her. The whispering voices, the cry of "help me," filled her mind, growing more frantic, desperate. It felt as if the walls were closing in on her, the air becoming heavier, suffocating. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her body unwilling to obey her frantic commands to flee. You promised. The voice, sweet and innocent yet filled with an unnatural desperation, slid into her mind like a slick, chilling shadow. You promised you'd help me. You promised I wouldn't be alone. Lily's stomach twisted as the doll shuffled closer, its wooden joints creaking with every movement. She could see the faint sheen of moonlight glinting off its cracked, porcelain face, its glassy eyes staring at her with eerie precision. And it was moving, it was coming for her. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't move. Her chest tightened with the oppressive weight of terror, and she felt like she was sinking into the floor, the ground pulling her under. Then, just as suddenly, the whispers stopped. Lily's eyes snapped to the doll. It had stopped only a few feet away from her now. Its gaze fixed on her, the eyes almost alive, as though they were seeing her, not just looking at her, but perceiving her, judging her. Her throat felt dry as she tried to speak, to ask it why it was tormenting her, why it was moving. But no words came. Instead, the doll tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, its cracked lips curling into the faintest, most twisted semblance of a smile. A chill ran down Lily's spine, and she felt something shift in the room. A presence, an awareness, something ancient and powerful, as though the doll was no longer merely a vessel for Mary's trapped soul, but something much worse. "Why did you come back?" The whisper now filled the room, but it wasn't coming from the doll's mouth. It was coming from all around her. "Why did you return, if not to help me?" Lily's legs finally moved, her body jerking into motion as she stumbled backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the nearest object to defend herself. Her fingers brushed the edge of an old wooden crate, but there was nothing useful there, nothing that could protect her from whatever had just awakened in the attic. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, this time with a note of pure malice. "You should have left me alone." Suddenly, everything went dark. The light bulb flickered, then sputtered out entirely, leaving the room in pitch blackness. The attic, once an innocuous storage space, now felt like a tomb, silent, suffocating, and unwelcoming. Lily's breath came in ragged gasps, her pulse racing. She could hear the scraping of porcelain feet against the floor again, louder this time, closer. A faint, cold breath brushed across the back of her neck, and Lily whirled around, her heart slamming against her chest. But there was nothing there, only the darkness, only the oppressive silence. The attic door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. Panic surged through Lily's veins. She scrambled to the window, hoping to break the glass, to escape, but it was sealed shut, like everything else in the house. The walls pressed in on her, the darkness now an almost physical force. And then she saw it. The doll was standing in front of her, close, too close, its porcelain hands raised, fingers twitching as though it was reaching for her. Its eyes were glowing now, the glass catching the faintest hint of moonlight. The once innocent smile on its face had twisted into something far darker, something filled with rage. Lily backed away from it, but there was no room to escape. She was trapped, cornered by a thing she couldn't fully understand. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands trembled as she reached into her pockets for the book Mr. Blackwell had given her. The ritual, she thought. She had to perform it. She had to end this. The book was still there, heavy in her hand, the pages worn and fragile with age. She flipped it open in desperation, scanning the pages, trying to find the words that would break the curse. But as she read aloud the incantation, her voice trembling as she forced the words past her lips, the doll's head tilted again, its eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop me?" The voice filled the room with a sound that was both childlike and terrifyingly deep, like the echoes of something ancient that had never truly died. The doll's fingers twitched again, this time more violently, and the air around Lily seemed to grow colder. The whispering voices returned, this time louder, distorted, like a cacophony of countless souls crying out in unison. "I don't want to be free anymore," the doll whispered, its voice dripping with venom. "I want you. I want your soul. I want you to stay with me." Lily's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled backward, her vision blurring. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air becoming thick and suffocating, as though the house itself was alive, suffused with the malevolent energy of the doll. She tried to keep reading, to finish the ritual, but the words tangled in her mind, the ancient language slipping away from her like water through her fingers. The doll's smile widened. "You are mine now, Lily," it said, its voice an unbearable mixture of Mary's innocent plea and something darker, something far more powerful. "You belong to me. Forever." The attic began to spin, and Lily's world tilted into darkness. Her head swam with the weight of her failure. She had come here with hope, to end the curse, to free the trapped soul of a young girl. But now, the very house seemed to reject her, to consume her with the same hunger that had claimed Mary so many years ago. She reached out one last time for the book, but as her fingers touched its pages, the attic spun faster. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more shrill. And then there was silence. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as the truth of her situation became painfully clear. The doll's whispering voice had grown louder, its words blending with the dark energy of the house. It wasn't just the doll that she was battling. It was the entire house, its walls alive with a hunger that only grew stronger the more she struggled. Every inch of the attic felt like it was closing in, an oppressive force pressing on her from all sides. The silence between the whispers was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of the doll's porcelain feet as it approached, its cold, unblinking eyes fixed on her. Her fingers still trembled as she held the ancient book, its pages glowing with an otherworldly light that seemed to pulse in time with her racing heartbeat. She had found the truth, the curse. To break it, to set Mary's spirit free and sever the bond that bound the doll to this world, it required sacrifice. Her life force. The words echoed in her mind like a drumbeat, relentless and unavoidable. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, a decision to live or to die. The doll was standing right in front of her now, its smile stretched unnaturally wide, as if it could taste the fear radiating from her. There was no escape. The attic had become her prison, and the house had become something far more sinister, something alive. The whispers, the tapping of the doll's feet, the suffocating darkness, they were all part of the house's hunger, a hunger that had never been satiated, a hunger that had claimed souls for generations. "I will never leave you." The voice was chilling, a sound that came from all around her, reverberating in her skull. It was the voice of Mary, but it had morphed, twisted into something darker, something more sinister. "You will never escape, Lily. You are already part of me." The words cut through her like a blade, and for a moment, Lily wondered if it was too late to turn back. Had she already lost? Had the curse already sunk its claws into her soul, making her another victim, another lost piece of the house's dark history? The attic seemed to grow darker, the air colder, and Lily could feel the pressure building within her chest. She clutched the book tighter, the pages turning under her trembling fingers as she desperately searched for a way to break the curse without sacrificing herself. The doll took a step forward, its feet scraping the wooden floor in an agonizingly slow movement. Its eyes never left her, the glassy pupils fixed on her with a knowing malice, as if it could sense her inner turmoil, her hesitation. "You think you have a choice?" The doll's voice dripped with venom. "You never did." Lily's breath caught in her throat. The air was thick with a scent of decay, a stale, suffocating presence that made it impossible to think. The house was alive, and it had been feeding on fear for years, a dark and insatiable force. The walls creaked as if they were listening, watching, waiting for the right moment to claim her. She could feel it now, something stirring deep within her. The house, the doll, and the curse, they were all part of her, woven into her very being. She had come here to break the curse, to save Mary. But what if the truth was that the house could never be saved? What if it was all part of a never-ending cycle, a loop that would continue for eternity, feeding off the souls of the living? The whispers grew louder, their voices becoming a chorus of agony and despair. She could almost hear the souls of those who had come before her, their mournful wails echoing through the dark corners of the attic, pleading for release, begging for freedom. But the house would never release them. Lily's hand clenched around the book. She had to make a choice. She couldn't keep running from it, couldn't keep hiding in the dark. The curse was real. The doll's power was real. And if she didn't act, it would claim her, just as it had claimed everyone else who had stepped foot in this cursed place. Her eyes darted back to the doll. Its smile was still there, its eyes fixed on her. It knew what she had to do. It knew that she was the next sacrifice, the next soul to be devoured by the house. She glanced at the book again. The ritual was clear. The words were etched into her mind, but they were not enough. There was no easy way out. There was no way to free Mary, to end the curse, without paying the price. And yet, in the back of her mind, something whispered. There had to be another way. But was there? Lily's hand shook as she reached for the doll, the porcelain cold beneath her fingertips. She could feel its malevolent energy, its twisted presence pulsing through the very air. She could hear its whispers, its promises of eternal torment. If she could just destroy it. She pulled the doll closer, holding it in her trembling hands, her heart racing as the words from the book rang through her mind like a mantra. By the blood of the innocent, I bind you. By the darkness of the curse, I break you. But as the words left her lips, something unexpected happened. The doll's eyes flashed bright, burning with a malevolent light, and suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening screech. Lily recoiled in shock, dropping the doll as it twisted and writhed in her hands, its porcelain form cracking and splitting apart like an explosion. The curse fought back. You can't undo it, the doll's voice screeched, growing louder and more distorted. You can't stop me. The walls shook, and the house groaned with a life of its own, the floorboards beneath her feet creaking as if they were about to collapse. The air became suffocating, oppressive, as though the house was collapsing in on itself, threatening to drag Lily into the void with it. The attic seemed to pulse with energy, dark and powerful, a force so strong that Lily could feel it in her very bones. The whispers grew deafening, and she realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't just the doll that was alive, it was everything. The house itself was feeding off her fear, feeding off the souls trapped within it, growing stronger with each passing moment. Lily's vision blurred as the weight of the curse pressed down on her, suffocating her with its dark power. Her thoughts were clouded, her breath shallow, and she could feel herself slipping. She was losing herself. But then, something in her snapped. The air thickened with energy as Lily finally understood. She didn't have to sacrifice herself. The house had offered her an ultimatum, but it had underestimated her strength. The curse may have been bound to the doll, to the house, but Lily was not just anyone. She was stronger than the darkness, stronger than the fear. She had come here to break the cycle, to set things right, and she would do it on her own terms. With a cry of defiance, Lily gathered all the strength she could muster and forced the words from her lips. By the light of the lost, I break the chains. By the blood of the broken, I end your reign. The words echoed through the room like a shockwave, shaking the house to its core. The doll's screeching voice faltered, and the oppressive darkness began to dissipate. The air cleared, and the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And then, silence. Lily's breath was ragged, her chest heaving as the silence stretched around her like a suffocating cloak. She stood alone in the attic, the doll's broken form scattered at her feet, its once glassy eyes now dull and lifeless. The oppressive darkness had lifted, and the air, thick with the stench of old wood and dust, seemed to feel lighter, almost as if the house itself were exhaling a long-held breath. But Lily knew better than to believe it was over. The house was not finished with her. She staggered backward, her legs weak beneath her as the weight of the ritual settled on her, the energy surging through her like a burning current. The words had been enough to stop the doll, to destroy its hold over the house, but that did not mean the curse was gone. The house itself was a living entity, its foundations soaked in the blood and sorrow of the souls it had claimed. It would fight back. It always did. Her hands shook as she looked at the remnants of the doll, its porcelain pieces lying scattered across the floor. A sense of dread crawled up her spine as she crouched beside the pieces, the very thought of touching them again making her stomach churn. She needed to get out of here, needed to leave before the house claimed her like it had so many before. But she knew that wasn't the solution. The house wouldn't just let her go. A low, guttural growl suddenly filled the air, reverberating through the walls and floorboards. Lily froze, her blood running cold as the sound rumbled like thunder from deep within the house. It was as though the house had come alive again, angered by her defiance. The floor beneath her feet creaked, groaned, and shook as if the very foundation was beginning to shift. "You think you can break me?" The voice was a low, demonic rasp, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot destroy me. You're part of me now. The curse is not broken. It is reborn." Lily stood up quickly, her heart pounding as the growl deepened into a deafening roar. The walls of the attic seemed to warp and stretch, and the wooden beams overhead creaked as though the entire house were bending under the weight of its own malevolence. The attic door, once a pathway out, slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing her inside. The temperature in the room dropped. A chill, so cold it burned, seeped through her skin, and she could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes watching her. The darkness was returning, creeping along the edges of her vision, pulling at her like an invisible force. The whispers, the voices of the trapped souls, began to swell around her, rising up like a storm. They were angry now, pleading, screaming for release. "Lily, you cannot stop it." The voice of Mary echoed through the room, its tone hollow and distant. "You cannot undo what has been done. The house will never let you leave." Lily's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the floor, clutching the broken doll's pieces. She could feel the power of the curse rising around her, like a suffocating cloud. Her mind was reeling, the weight of the voices and the house's power pressing in on her. There was no way out. Not this time. But as the house seemed to close in on her, something flickered at the corner of her mind, a fleeting memory, a long-forgotten feeling. Her grandmother's words echoed faintly. "The house will only claim you if you let it. You are stronger than the curse. You must remember that." Lily gasped, her fingers tightening around the broken porcelain shards. Her grandmother had always told her there was power in the blood, in the ties that bound them to the house. The curse was strong, but so was she. Her family had lived here for generations, but they hadn't been defeated by the house. They had survived. She stood up shakily, the doll's pieces still clutched tightly in her hands. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She understood now. She understood that the house was feeding on her fear, on her doubt. It was her connection to the house, her attachment to the pain and suffering of her ancestors that the house thrived on. She could break that connection. The growls and whispers grew louder, but Lily stood tall, her grip tightening around the doll. She closed her eyes, focusing on the bloodline, on the generations of people who had lived and died in this cursed house. They weren't just victims. They were warriors, survivors of the curse's power. They had fought, and they had lost, but Lily wasn't going to lose.